Captain Sarah Ace Martinez had been flying C-130 Hercules transport aircraft for 12 years. But she'd never heard terror like this, crackling through her radio at 0347 hours on that storm-lashed September morning. The voice cut through static, and hurricane winds with the desperate edge of a man watching death approach in slow motion. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Any station, any station. This is Trident 6 requesting immediate emergency extraction. The transmission broke apart as lightning, interfered with communications, then returned stronger. We are 8 souls at grid November 77 Delta, taking effective enemy fire, and the whole damn place is going underwater. Martinez had been conducting routine cargo operations between Barksdale Air Force Base and forward operating bases along the Gulf Coast when Hurricane Delta decided to rewrite the weather forecast. What meteorologists had predicted as a manageable Category 2 storm had exploded into a monster Category 4 hurricane in less than 6 hours, catching everyone from emergency planners to military operations completely off guard. She'd been ordered to return to base immediately, but the distress call changed everything. Trident 6, this is Angel 77, C-130 Hercules, approximately 40 miles from your position. Martinez responded, her trained pilot's voice steady, despite her racing heart. Say again your situation and number of personnel. The response came from Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Thompson, though Martinez didn't know his name yet. What she heard was the voice of a professional warrior pushed to the absolute limit. Angel 77, we are 8 Navy SEALs, completed. Primary mission approximately 2 hours ago. Extraction helicopter RTBD due to weather. Our fallback extraction site is now completely compromised. Thompson's voice grew more urgent as explosions echoed in the background. Water level rising approximately 3 feet per hour. Runway is 50% submerged and deteriorating rapidly. We have multiple enemy combatants in the area estimate squad-sized element moving through the storm, actively hunting us. They know we're here. Martinez felt her stomach drop. She knew exactly which airfield Thompson was describing, a small regional airport that served as an emergency extraction point for special operations. In good weather, it was barely adequate for C-130 operations. In the current conditions, it was essentially a waterlogged death trap. Her co-pilot, Major Rick Ghost Johnson, had been monitoring the conversation with growing alarm. He leaned over and tapped his weather display, showing the hurricane's eye wall moving directly over their area of operations. Wind speeds at ground level were registering 140 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 160. Even if they could somehow reach the flooded airfield, landing in those conditions would be virtually impossible. Angel 77, we are in the airport control tower, approximately 30 feet above current flood level. Thompson continued, his voice nearly drowned out by howling wind. We have 2 wounded. Petty Officer Rodriguez took shrapnel from an IED during mission completion, and Petty Officer Kim has a GSW to the shoulder from enemy contact during movement to extraction site. Both are mobile, but need immediate medical attention. The tactical situation painted itself clearly in Martinez's mind. 8 elite Navy SEALs, including 2 wounded, trapped in a flooded airport control tower with hostile forces closing in. No way out except up. And she was the only aircraft within range capable of carrying 8 fully equipped operators, plus their critical intelligence. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, her flight engineer, had been quietly monitoring aircraft systems and weather data. She caught Martinez's eye and shook her head grimly. Ma'am, conditions at that field are completely outside operational parameters. Even if we could get in, the runway length available is insufficient for normal C-130 operations. Technical Sergeant David Bull Williams, their loadmaster, overheard the conversation from his position near the cargo bay. Captain, I've configured medical stations for casualties before. If we're going in, I can have litter stations ready in 5 minutes. Trident 6, what's your tactical situation? Martinez asked, stalling for time while she processed the impossible mathematics of the rescue attempt. How much time do you have? Thompson's answer chilled her to the bone. Angel 7-7. Enemy forces are approximately 400 meters. Out and closing. They're moving slowly due to weather conditions, but they have thermal imaging capability and they know our general location. Based on water rise rate and enemy movement, we have maybe 90 minutes before this position becomes untenable. The SEAL commander's voice took on the flat, professional tone of a man reporting his own death sentence. Be advised, we are carrying classified materials that cannot fall into enemy hands. If extraction is not possible, we will implement contingency protocols. Martinez understood the euphemism the SEALs would fight to the death rather than be captured, and they'd destroy their intelligence rather than let it be compromised. Copy all, Trident 6. Stand by, Martinez responded, and switched to her internal communication system. Crew, you heard the situation. This is not a drill, and this is not a normal mission. Those are 8 of America's finest down there, and they're going to die if someone doesn't help them. She looked at each of her crew members in turn. Johnson, her co-pilot for the past 18 months, who'd flown combat missions over Afghanistan and Iraq. Santos, her flight engineer, who could make a C-130 fly when it had no business being airborne. Williams, her loadmaster, who jumped into combat zones to rescue wounded soldiers. I'm not ordering anyone to come with me, Martinez said quietly. This is going to be the most dangerous thing any of us have ever attempted. The weather conditions alone should ground us. The tactical situation is completely compromised. And even if we somehow manage to get those SEALs aboard, the flight back to base is going to be through the worst part of the hurricane. Johnson spoke first. Ma'am, those are American operators down there. We don't leave people behind. Santos nodded grimly. Captain, I've kept this bird flying through worse than a little wind and rain. Williams was already moving toward the cargo bay. I'll start prepping the medical stations. And Captain? He turned back toward the cockpit. My little brother is a Navy SEAL. If he was down there, I'd want someone like you coming for him. Martinez felt a surge of pride in her crew, mixed with the crushing weight of responsibility. In 15 minutes, she would either be dead or she would be attempting the most dangerous landing of her career to save 8 American heroes. She switched back to the emergency frequency. Trident 6, this is Angel 7-7. We are inbound to your position for immediate extraction. Prepare. Landing zone as best as possible and mark your position with infrared strobes. We'll be coming in fast and low. Thompson's response carried the first note of hope she'd heard in his voice. Angel 7-7, copy inbound for extraction. You're either completely insane or the finest pilot in the United States Air Force. Martinez smiled grimly as she banked the massive C-130 toward the hurricane's eye wall. Trident 6, I'm about to find out which one. The radio erupted with Colonel James Mitchell's voice before Martinez could even begin her approach to the disaster zone. Her commanding officer's words cut through the static like a razor blade, each syllable dripping with authority and barely controlled fury. Angel 7-7, this is Barksdale Control. Captain Martinez, you will abort your current heading immediately and return to base. That is a direct order. Mitchell's voice carried the weight of 25 years of military command, the kind of authority that had sent thousands of airmen into combat and brought most of them home alive. Martinez's hands tightened on the C-130's controls as she continued. Flying toward Hurricane Delta's massive storm wall. Through her windscreen, she could see the hurricane stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the horizon, a rotating wall of destruction that Meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation superstorm. Lightning flickered constantly within the dark clouds, creating an almost stroboscopic effect against the pre-dawn darkness. Colonel Mitchell, 8 American operators need immediate extraction. Martinez responded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Trident 6 is taking enemy fire, and their position will be overrun within the hour. Captain, I have the weather reports right in front of me. Mitchell's voice rose to nearly a shout. Surface winds at that location are sustained at 140 miles per hour with gusts exceeding 160. The runway is 50% flooded. You're talking about landing a C-130 in conditions that would challenge a helicopter in perfect weather. Major Johnson, seated beside Martinez, pulled up the tactical display showing their target airfield. What he saw confirmed every one of Mitchell's fears. The small regional airport that served as an emergency extraction point looked like something from an apocalyptic movie. Satellite imagery showed the runway disappearing under rapidly rising floodwater, with debris from destroyed buildings scattered across what remained of the landing surface. "Ma'am," Johnson said quietly, pointing at his calculations, "even in perfect conditions, we'd need at least 5,000 feet of runway for a full load landing. Current usable runway length is approximately 2,800 feet and shrinking by the minute." Staff Sergeant Santos leaned forward from her flight engineer's position, her face illuminated by the red glow of warning lights that had been cascading across her instrument panel since they'd first detected the hurricane's outer bands. "Captain, I'm showing wind shear advisories, severe turbulence warnings, and embedded thunderstorm activity along our entire approach route. Our weather radar can't even penetrate far enough into the storm to show us what we're flying into." But Martinez's mind wasn't focused on the technical impossibilities. She was thinking about her father, Master Sergeant Robert Martinez, who died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan when she was 18 years old. His final mission had been a combat search and rescue operation flying into hostile territory to extract a wounded Army Ranger who'd been left behind during a firefight. "Angel 77, this is Colonel Mitchell. I'm ordering you to acknowledge and comply immediately." The colonel's voice had taken on the tone of a man whose patience had been completely exhausted. "I will not lose a 4-man aircrew and a $40 million aircraft on a mission that has zero probability of success." Technical Sergeant Williams had moved to the cargo bay where he was already preparing medical evacuation equipment, laying out litter stations and checking their emergency medical supplies. His voice came through the intercom system with grim determination. "Captain, I've got space configured for 8 passengers plus medical gear. If we're going to do this thing, I'm ready." The weight of command had never felt heavier on Martinez's shoulders. She understood exactly what Colonel Mitchell was trying to protect her from. The C-130 Hercules was an incredibly robust aircraft, but it had limitations. Landing on a flooded runway in hurricane-force winds wasn't just dangerous. It was theoretically impossible, according to every flight manual ever written. "Colonel, I understand the risks," Martinez replied, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that made her crew lean forward to listen. "But those 8 men down there took the same oath I did. They volunteered to go in harm's way to protect American interests, and now they're trapped with no way out." She paused, watching the hurricane's eye wall growing larger through her windscreen. The storm looked like a living thing, rotating slowly, but with tremendous power, its outer bands already beginning to buffet the C-130 with turbulence that made normal conversation difficult. "Sir, if my father had been down there, I'd want someone to try." Colonel Mitchell's response came after a long pause, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else: resignation, perhaps, or understanding. "Captain Martinez, your father was a good man and a fine NCO, but he's dead because he took risks that didn't pay off. I won't have his daughter following the same path." "Negative, sir," Martinez replied firmly. "My father died because he was trying to save an American soldier. That soldier lived, got married, and has 3 kids now. My father died doing exactly what he was supposed to do." Johnson caught Martinez's eye and nodded slowly. He'd served with her long enough to know that once she'd made this kind of decision, there was no changing her mind. More importantly, he knew she was right. The 8 Navy SEALs trapped in that flooding control tower weren't just names on a roster. They were fellow Americans who'd volunteered for the most dangerous missions their country could offer. "Angel 77, you are ordered to return to base immediately." Mitchell's voice crackled through increasing atmospheric interference. "Captain Martinez, if you continue on your current heading, you will face court-martial proceedings." Martinez looked at each of her crew members in turn. Johnson's jaw was set with determination. Santos was running pre-landing checklists despite the official order to abort. Williams was in the cargo bay, preparing to save lives. They were all volunteers, and they'd all made their choice. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm experiencing significant radio interference due to weather conditions," Martinez said calmly, her hand moving toward the communication controls. "I'm having difficulty receiving your transmission clearly." "Captain Martinez." "Do not," Mitchell's voice began, but Martinez cut him off by switching off her primary radio and activating only the emergency frequency that connected her directly to the trapped SEAL team. The C-130's cockpit fell into relative silence, broken only by the increasing roar of hurricane winds against the aircraft's hull and the steady drone of the 4 turboprop engines. They were now completely cut off from their chain of command, flying into the worst storm any of them had ever seen, attempting a rescue that every regulation said was impossible. "Well," Johnson said quietly, "I guess we're committed now." Martinez smiled grimly as the first powerful wind shear hit their aircraft, causing it to drop nearly 100 feet in seconds before she regained control. "Ghost, we've been committed since the moment we heard those boys calling for help. Now let's go bring some heroes home." The hurricane's eye wall loomed ahead like a wall of solid darkness, crackling with lightning and rotating with hypnotic, terrifying power. Behind them, Colonel Mitchell was undoubtedly scrambling search and rescue aircraft and preparing to explain to his superiors how he'd lost one of his best crews to a Category 4 hurricane. But ahead of them, 8 Navy SEALs were counting down. The minutes until enemy forces overran their position or rising floodwater forced them from their refuge. For Martinez and her crew, the choice had never really been a choice at all. The first indication of Hurricane Delta's true power came when the C-130 Hercules hit the storm's outer bands at 8,000 feet altitude. What had been manageable turbulence suddenly transformed into a violent, chaotic assault that threw the massive aircraft around like a child's toy. Martinez felt her stomach drop as the plane plummeted nearly 300 feet in a matter of seconds, then rocketed back up with G-forces that pressed her deep into her pilot's seat. "Jesus Christ!" Major Johnson shouted, his hands instinctively grabbing for his restraint harness as loose equipment in the cockpit became projectiles. A clipboard flew past his head and shattered against the side window, while coffee from an earlier mission splattered across the instrument panel in brown streaks. Staff Sergeant Santos's voice crackled through the intercom from her flight engineer's station, barely audible over the increasing roar of wind against the aircraft's aluminum skin. "Captain, I'm reading wind speeds of 160 miles per hour. And climbing. We're getting massive downdrafts followed by equally massive updrafts. The aircraft is experiencing stress loads approaching maximum design limits." Through the rain-streaked windscreen, Martinez could see the full scope of Hurricane Delta's fury revealing itself. The storm stretched from horizon to horizon, a rotating wall of destruction that looked more like an alien landscape than anything earthly. Lightning didn't just flash occasionally. It strobed constantly, creating an almost daylight effect that revealed towering thunderheads reaching up to 50,000 feet. The entire storm system was rotating slowly, but visibly, like watching a massive clock made of clouds and death. Angel 77. This is Trident 6. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice broke through the increasing static on the emergency frequency. The SEAL commander sounded breathless, and explosions echoed clearly in the background of his transmission. Our tactical situation is deteriorating rapidly. Enemy contact is now within 200 meters of our position. Martinez keyed her microphone while fighting to maintain control of the aircraft, as another violent wind shear threatened to flip them inverted. Copy, Trident 6. We are approximately 20 minutes from your position, but we're encountering severe weather conditions. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours as the C-130 fought its way deeper into the hurricane's embrace. The aircraft bucked and rolled with each massive gust of wind, its 4 powerful turboprop engines struggling to maintain airspeed against headwinds that sometimes exceeded the plane's normal cruising speed. Ice began forming on the wings despite the relatively warm Gulf Coast temperatures, a sign that they were flying through the hurricane's upper atmosphere, where supercooled water droplets froze instantly on contact. Technical Sergeant Williams's voice came through the intercom from the cargo bay, where he was securing equipment that had broken loose during the violent turbulence. Captain, I've got medical stations prepared for 8 passengers, but I'm having to tie down everything that isn't nailed down back here. This turbulence is unlike anything I've experienced in 15 years of flying. The hurricane's eye wall appeared on their weather radar as a solid red mass, the most dangerous part of any hurricane, where wind speeds reached their maximum and the atmospheric violence was beyond anything found elsewhere in nature. Martinez knew that once they entered the eye wall, they would be flying blind through a vertical tunnel of wind and lightning that could tear their aircraft apart in seconds. Santos, give me a systems report, Martinez called out, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Years of combat flying had taught her that panic was the enemy of survival, and her crew needed to hear confidence in her voice. Captain, we're running in the green across all major systems, but I'm seeing fluctuations in our electrical systems due to lightning strikes, Santos reported, her voice professional despite the obvious stress. We've been hit by lightning 4 times in the past 10 minutes. So far, the aircraft's lightning protection systems are holding, but we're pushing our luck. As if summoned by her words, a massive lightning bolt struck the C-130's left wing with a flash that temporarily blinded everyone in the cockpit. The electrical discharge traveled along the aircraft's aluminum skin before dissipating through static discharge wicks, but not before causing every electrical system to flicker ominously. The smell of ozone filled the cockpit, and several warning lights illuminated briefly before returning to normal. That was a big one, Johnson muttered, blinking to clear the spots from his vision. I can still see the outline of that bolt when I close my eyes. Through breaks in the storm clouds, Martinez caught glimpses of the devastation below. Hurricane Delta was rewriting the Louisiana coastline in real time. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared under storm surge that reached 15 feet above normal sea level. Trees that had stood for decades were being uprooted and tossed around like toothpicks. Buildings that had weathered previous hurricanes were being stripped down to their foundations by winds that exceeded anything in recorded history. Trident 6, this is Angel 77, Martinez called out during a brief moment when atmospheric interference lessened. What's your current tactical status? Thompson's response came immediately, punctuated by the distinctive crack of M4 carbines. Firing on full automatic. Angel 77, we are in heavy contact. Enemy forces have reached the terminal building and are attempting to advance on our position. Water level in the control tower is now at 15 feet and rising. We are running low on ammunition. The urgency in the SEAL commander's voice sent ice through Martinez's veins. She'd heard that tone before during combat missions in Afghanistan. It was the sound of professional warriors facing overwhelming odds and calculating their final options. "Sir, we have 2 critical wounded who need immediate medical attention." Thompson continued, his voice nearly drowned out by an explosion that sounded close enough to shake the control tower. Petty Officer Rodriguez is losing consciousness from blood loss, and Petty Officer Kim's shoulder wound has become infected. If we don't get medical evacuation within 30 minutes, we're going to lose them. Martinez pushed the C-130's throttles forward, coaxing every bit of speed from the aircraft, despite the Hurricane's attempts to slow their progress. The 4 turboprop engines roared at maximum power, their propeller blades biting into air, so turbulent it felt more like flying through liquid than atmosphere. "Santos, I need everything this bird has," Martinez called out. "Override the engine limiters if you have to. Those boys are dying down there." "Roger, Captain." "Overriding engine parameters now." Santos's fingers flew across her control panel, pushing the C-130's power plants beyond their normal operational limits. "We're running hot, but she'll hold together." The Hurricane's eye wall loomed directly ahead now, a vertical wall of destruction that rose from sea level to the edge of space. Lightning flickered constantly within its depths, and the wind shear indicators on Martinez's instruments went completely off scale. Weather radar showed solid precipitation, a mixture of rain, hail, and debris that would sandblast any aircraft foolish enough to enter. "Crew, prepare for eye wall penetration," Martinez announced, her voice carrying across the intercom to every corner of the aircraft. "This is going to be the roughest flying any of us have ever experienced." But 8 American heroes are counting on us to get through this storm and bring them home. As the C-130 Hercules plunged into Hurricane Delta's eye wall, the last thing Martinez heard before the storm's fury overwhelmed their communications was the sound of gunfire from the flooded airport below, where 8 Navy SEALs were making their final stand against impossible odds. Breaking through Hurricane Delta's eye wall was like emerging from the gates of hell into a cathedral of destruction. The C-130 Hercules suddenly found itself in the storm's eye, bizarre oasis of relative calm surrounded by towering walls of rotating clouds that reached up beyond the aircraft's service ceiling. The contrast was so dramatic that Major Johnson's ears popped from the rapid pressure change, and for a moment, everyone in the cockpit experienced an eerie sense of weightlessness. "Holy Mother of God," Johnson whispered, staring upward through the cockpit windows at the Hurricane's eye. Above them, stars were actually visible through the circular opening, creating a surreal scene of peaceful sky surrounded by the most violent weather system on Earth. The eye wall rose around them like the inside of a massive stadium, its walls illuminated by constant lightning that flickered and danced in the rotating cloud formations. But Martinez's attention was focused downward, where her night vision goggles revealed a scene of absolute devastation. The Louisiana coastal town that had existed just hours earlier was completely gone, replaced by a dark expanse of churning water that stretched to the horizon. Buildings, vehicles, trees, everything had been swept away by the storm surge and winds that had peaked at over 180 miles per hour. "There!" Staff Sergeant Santos called out, pointing toward a faint cluster of lights barely visible through the darkness. 2 o'clock low, that's got to be the airport. Through her night vision equipment, Martinez could see the small regional airport that was serving as the SEAL's final refuge. What she saw made her stomach clench with dread. The runway that should have been 5,000 feet of solid concrete was now more than half submerged under black floodwater. Debris from destroyed buildings, chunks of concrete, twisted metal, sections of roofing lay scattered across what remained of the landing surface, like an obstacle course designed by someone with a death wish. Jesus, Ace, Johnson breathed, studying the tactical display that showed their approach options. The usable runway length is maybe 2,800 feet, and that's being generous. We need at least 4,500 feet for a normal landing with our current weight and configuration. Technical Sergeant Williams's voice crackled through the intercom from the cargo bay, where he'd been monitoring the SEAL team's radio transmissions. Captain, Trident 6 reports they're down to their last magazines of ammunition. Enemy forces are in the terminal building and attempting to reach the control tower. They estimate 5 minutes before their position is overrun. Martinez felt the weight of 8 lives pressing down on her shoulders as she began her approach to the impossible landing zone. The hurricane's eye provided them with perhaps 10 minutes of relatively calm air before the backside of the storm would engulf them again. It was now or never. Santos, give me approach speed calculations for minimum runway length, Martinez ordered, her hands already working the flight controls to line up the massive aircraft with what remained of the runway. I want flaps full, gear down, and every aerodynamic trick this bird has to offer. Roger, Captain. Computing now. Santos's fingers flew across her flight engineer's panel, calculating approach speeds that would allow them to touch down as slowly as possible while still maintaining enough airspeed to avoid stalling. Recommended approach speed is 115 knots, flaps full down, maximum reverse thrust on touchdown. Through her night vision goggles, Martinez could see muzzle flashes strobing from the airport. Terminal building enemy combatants were indeed advancing on the SEAL team's position. In the control tower, infrared strobes from the tower itself blinked desperately in the pre-programmed pattern that identified friendly forces. But she could see that the base of the tower was now surrounded by at least 3 feet of rapidly rising floodwater. Trident 6. This is Angel 77 beginning final approach. Martinez transmitted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Mark your position with IR strobes and prepare for immediate extraction. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's response came immediately, punctuated by the sound of grenades exploding and automatic weapons fire. Angel 77, IR strobes are active. Be advised, enemy forces are attempting to breach the control tower. We are prepared to move on your signal. The approach to the flooded runway was unlike anything Martinez had ever attempted. Instead of the normal 3-degree glide slope that commercial pilots used, she was bringing the C-130 down at nearly twice that angle, trading altitude for airspeed, in a way that violated every safety regulation ever written. The aircraft shuddered and bucked as it descended through layers of turbulent air created by the hurricane's interaction with the ground. Airspeed 120 and decreasing, Johnson called out, monitoring their instruments as they descended toward the chaos below. Altitude 500 feet and descending. Rate of descent 800 feet per minute. At 200 feet above the flooded airport, Martinez could see individual details that made her blood run cold. The first 1,000 feet of runway were completely underwater, with waves actually breaking across the concrete surface. What remained of the usable runway was littered with debris that would destroy their landing gear or puncture their tires. Worse yet, she could see enemy combatants moving around the terminal building, some of them carrying what appeared to be shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. Captain, I'm reading surface winds gusting to 60 knots with severe crosswind components, Santos reported, her voice tight with tension. We're going to have maybe one chance at this. There's no fuel for a go-around if we miss the approach. At 100 feet altitude, Martinez could see the full horror of their landing zone. The runway surface that wasn't underwater was cracked and broken, with sections of concrete completely missing where the storm surge had undermined the foundation. Oil and fuel from destroyed aircraft created rainbow slicks on the standing water, and she could actually see a small Cessna aircraft that had been picked up by the hurricane winds and deposited upside down in the middle of their landing path. "Flare! Flare! Flare!" Johnson called out as they crossed the runway threshold, his voice urgent but controlled. Martinez pulled back on the yoke, raising the C-130's nose to bleed off airspeed and prepare for touchdown. The massive aircraft seemed to hang in the air for an eternal moment, its 4 turboprop engines howling at reduced power as she tried to achieve the perfect balance between controlled flight and controlled crash. The main landing gear struck the flooded runway with tremendous force, sending geysers of water and debris shooting in all directions. For 5 terrifying seconds, the C-130 hydroplaned across the water-covered concrete, its wheels unable to find purchase on the slippery surface. Martinez felt the aircraft sliding sideways toward the runway edge as crosswinds caught the vertical stabilizer and tried to spin them around. "Come on, baby, grip," she muttered through clenched teeth, working the rudder pedals and differential braking to keep the aircraft aligned with the runway centerline. Suddenly, the tires found solid concrete beneath the standing water, and the C-130 lurched forward as its anti-skid braking system engaged. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, throwing everyone forward against the restraint harnesses as maximum. Reverse thrust and heavy braking fought against their momentum. "We're down! We're down!" Williams shouted from the cargo bay, already moving toward the ramp controls. Touchdown confirmed, aircraft secure, but their celebration was premature. Even as the C-130 rolled to a stop on the debris-strewn runway, muzzle flashes lit up the darkness around them, and the distinctive whistling sound of incoming rounds filled the air. The first enemy round struck the C-130's fuselage before the aircraft had even come to a complete stop, sending sparks flying from the aluminum skin and spiderwebbing the cockpit's side windows. Captain Martinez felt the massive aircraft shudder as bullets designed to penetrate body armor punched through the thin metal hull like it was made of paper. "Contact left! Contact left!" Major Johnson shouted, pointing toward muzzle flashes that had erupted from the destroyed terminal building. At least 6 enemy combatants were firing at the aircraft with automatic weapons, their tracer rounds creating deadly streams of light that crisscrossed the flooded runway like some hellish light show. Martinez kept the C-130's engines running at high idle, knowing that their survival depended on being ready for immediate takeoff. The 4 turboprop engines created a constant roar that mixed with the crack of incoming rifle fire and the splash of bullets striking standing water around the aircraft. She could feel each impact through the aircraft's structure as enemy rounds found their mark. "Williams, get that ramp down now," Martinez commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos, as she worked to keep the aircraft positioned for the fastest possible extraction. Technical Sergeant Williams was already moving toward the cargo bay controls, his M4 carbine slung across his chest and ready for action. The veteran loadmaster had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan and knew the sound of combat better than most. "Infantryman, ramp coming down, 30 seconds. He called back, his fingers working the hydraulic controls that would lower the C-130's massive cargo ramp. From the airport control tower, 8 Navy SEALs were returning fire with disciplined, accurate bursts from their weapons. Lieutenant Commander Thompson's voice crackled through the radio frequency, barely audible over the sound of gunfire and explosions. "Angel 77, we are moving to your position. Covering fire inbound." The SEALs had been fighting for their lives for the past 4 hours, and their ammunition situation was critical. Each operator was down to his final magazines, having expended most of their combat load during the running firefight that had brought them to the control tower. But they were still Navy SEALs, among the most elite warriors in the world, and they moved with the fluid precision that marked professionals at the absolute pinnacle of their trade. Staff Sergeant Santos's voice came through the intercom with urgent intensity. "Captain, I'm reading multiple hydraulic system warnings. Enemy fire has hit our primary flight control hydraulics. We're losing pressure rapidly." Martinez felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications. Without hydraulic pressure, the C-130 would become increasingly difficult to control, especially during takeoff. The massive aircraft relied on hydraulically powered flight controls to manage its enormous control surfaces, and losing those systems would make flying the plane like trying to steer a ship with a broken rudder. Through her night vision goggles, Martinez could see the 8 SEALs beginning their movement from the control tower toward the aircraft. They moved in 2 teams of 4, using classic bounding overwatch tactics, where one team provided covering fire while the other moved forward. Even in the chaos of combat, their movements were coordinated and professional. But the enemy had been waiting for exactly this moment. As soon as the SEALs left the relative safety of the control tower, additional combatants emerged from concealed positions around the airport perimeter. Muzzle flashes erupted from at least 3 different locations, creating a crossfire that forced the SEALs to take cover behind concrete barriers that were themselves being chewed apart by sustained automatic weapons fire. "Jesus, they're getting hammered out there," Johnson muttered, watching the firefight develop through his side window. Tracer rounds were flying in both directions, creating a deadly light show against the dark backdrop of the flooded airport. Williams had reached the cargo ramp controls and was already lowering the massive door that would allow the SEALs to board. But as the ramp descended, enemy fire immediately began striking the aircraft's interior, forcing him to take cover behind cargo tie-down points while bullets ricocheted around the cargo bay. Taking effective fire in the cargo bay, Williams reported, his voice steady despite the bullets whistling around him. "I'm returning fire and providing cover for the SEALs." The veteran loadmaster unslung his M4 carbine and moved to a firing position at the edge of the cargo ramp. His first burst caught an enemy combatant who had been advancing on the SEAL's position, dropping the hostile fighter with 3 rounds center mass. Williams had qualified expert with the rifle for 8 consecutive years, and his marksmanship skills were about to prove invaluable. "Trident 6, this is Angel 77, Martinez transmitted. "We are taking heavy fire and have sustained aircraft damage. You need to move now." Thompson's response came between bursts of gunfire. "Angel 77, we are moving. 2 wounded require assistance. Covering fire appreciated." Martinez could see 2 of the SEALs being supported by their teammates as they bounded from cover to cover across the flooded tarmac. One man, she would later learn, it was Petty Officer Rodriguez, was clearly struggling with blood loss from his earlier wound, while another SEAL had his arm in an improvised sling. The enemy fire intensified as the SEALs approached the aircraft, with at least 2 additional fighting positions opening up from the far side of the terminal building. Bullets struck the C-130's propellers, sending chips of metal flying and creating an ominous vibration through the airframe that Martinez could feel through her. "Flight controls. Santos, how long until we lose hydraulic control completely?" Martinez asked, her hands already working to compensate for the aircraft's increasingly sluggish response to control inputs. "Maybe 5 minutes, Captain. The system is bleeding pressure, faster than the pumps can maintain it," Santos replied, her voice tight with concentration as she monitored the cascade of warning lights across her engineer's panel. Williams continued, laying down suppressing fire from the cargo ramp, his M4 carbine chattering in controlled bursts as he engaged enemy positions. His accurate fire was keeping several hostile fighters pinned down, allowing the SEALs to advance across the most dangerous section of open ground between the control tower and the aircraft. First group boarding now. Williams called out as 4 SEALs reached the cargo ramp and scrambled aboard the aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was among them, blood streaming from a facial wound caused by concrete fragments, but still directing his team's movements with hand signals. The remaining 4 SEALs were still 50 meters away, moving as fast as their wounded teammates would allow. But enemy fighters were converging on their position from multiple directions, and Martinez could see muzzle flashes getting closer to the aircraft with each passing second. We've got maybe 60 seconds before this becomes untenable, Martinez announced to her crew, her eyes constantly scanning between the approaching SEALs and the instruments showing their rapidly deteriorating aircraft systems. In the cargo bay, Williams had shifted his fire to support the second group of SEALs, but enemy rounds were now striking the aircraft's interior with increasing frequency. One bullet shattered a cargo bay light fixture directly above his head, showering him with sparks and broken glass. The final 4 SEALs were now 20 meters away and closing fast, but the enemy fire was reaching a crescendo that threatened to overwhelm them all. The last Navy SEAL tumbled through the cargo door just as Captain Martinez felt a sickening shudder run through the C-130's airframe. A bullet had found something critical in the aircraft's structure. Technical Sergeant Williams was still firing his M4 carbine from the cargo ramp when she made the decision that would either save them all or kill them in the next 30 seconds. "Ramp coming up. We're leaving now," Martinez shouted into her headset, simultaneously pushing all 4 throttles to maximum emergency power. The Allison T-56 turboprop engines screamed to life with a roar that drowned out even the sound of incoming gunfire, their propellers biting into the hurricane-saturated air with desperate fury. The massive cargo ramp was still grinding upward on its hydraulic pistons when Martinez released the wheel brakes and began her takeoff roll. Standard operating procedures called for a complete systems check, proper crew coordination, and a methodical approach to takeoff. But standard procedures didn't account for taking effective enemy fire while trying to extract special operations forces from a flooded runway in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane. "Jesus Christ, Ace," Major Johnson yelled, his hands flying to his instrument panel as the C-130 lurched forward with violent acceleration. "The ramp's not even closed yet." Williams had thrown himself flat on the cargo bay floor as the aircraft began moving, still clutching his rifle, but no longer able to return fire as the partially raised ramp blocked his view of the enemy positions. Behind him, 8 Navy SEALs were strapping themselves into the web seating along the cargo bay walls, several of them applying field dressings to wounds sustained during their sprint to the aircraft. The C-130 accelerated through standing water that was now nearly 4 feet deep across sections of the runway. Each wheel threw up massive rooster tails of spray that mixed floodwater with aviation fuel leaked from bullet holes in the aircraft's wing tanks. Martinez could feel the aircraft's wheels hydroplaning again as they hit patches of deeper water, the massive airplane sliding sideways despite her desperate inputs on the rudder pedals. Airspeed 60 knots and climbing. Johnson called out, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored their instruments. Warning lights continued to cascade across the instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel quantity decreasing, and electrical systems fluctuating from repeated lightning strikes and battle damage. Enemy tracer rounds continued to streak past the cockpit windows, some of them close enough that Martinez could feel the heat through the glass. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions now. The enemy had reinforcements arriving, even as she fought to get the aircraft airborne. One stream of tracers passed so close to the cockpit that the bullets left phosphorescent streaks across her night vision goggles. Staff Sergeant Santos' voice crackled through the intercom with devastating news. "Captain, We've lost primary hydraulic pressure completely, showing red lines across all flight control systems. The aircraft is going to become increasingly difficult to control as we gain airspeed. At 80 knots, the C-130 was approaching the critical decision point where Martinez would either achieve flying speed or run out of runway and crash into the Gulf of Mexico. But the shortened runway, damaged by storm surge and littered with debris, was giving them barely half the distance they needed for a normal takeoff. Flaps to takeoff position, Martinez commanded, pulling back slightly on the yoke to begin. Generating lift. The massive aircraft responded sluggishly, its damaged hydraulic systems making every control input feel like moving through thick mud. Through her peripheral vision, she could see enemy combatants actually running alongside the aircraft, firing at the engines and landing gear with automatic weapons. One fighter with an RPG launcher was setting up a firing position directly ahead of their takeoff path. If he got that rocket-propelled grenade off, it would turn the C-130 into a fireball. Williams, we've got an RPG threat at 12 o'clock. Johnson shouted into the intercom. The veteran loadmaster had managed to get the cargo ramp partially closed, but there was still a gap of several feet that he could use as a firing port. Rolling onto his stomach, he aimed his M4 carbine through the opening and sent a burst of accurate fire toward the RPG gunner. His round struck the fighter center mass just as the man was shouldering his weapon, sending him spinning into the floodwater with his rocket launcher unfired. RPG threat neutralized, Williams reported, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. At 95 knots, Martinez felt the first hint of lift as the C-130's massive wings began generating enough airflow to support the aircraft's weight. But they were still 20 knots below normal rotation speed and the end of the usable runway was rushing toward them with terrifying speed. "Ace, we're running out of concrete," Johnson warned, pointing through the windscreen at the black water that marked the end of the runway. "Rotate now, or we're going swimming." Martinez pulled back on the yoke with both hands, using every ounce of strength she possessed to force the damaged aircraft into the air. The C-130's nose came up reluctantly, its elevators struggling against the failed hydraulic systems that normally provided power assistance to the flight controls. For a heart-stopping moment, the aircraft hung in the balance between controlled flight and catastrophic crash. The main landing gear was still in contact with the runway, but the nose gear had lifted off, creating a dangerous attitude that threatened to send them into an unrecoverable stall. "Come on, baby, fly," Martinez whispered through gritted teeth, feeling sweat pour down her face despite the air conditioning. The 4 turboprop engines were screaming at maximum power, their propellers pulling every bit of thrust they could generate from the storm-tossed air. Suddenly, the C-130 broke free from the runway's grip and clawed its way into the air. The main landing gear left the concrete with a sensation Martinez felt through the entire airframe the moment when 80 tons of aircraft and human cargo committed itself entirely to the unforgiving laws of aerodynamics. But their problems were far from over. As they climbed away from the flooded airport, Martinez could see tracers still reaching toward them from the ground. Worse yet, the aircraft was flying like a wounded bird, requiring constant pressure on the controls to maintain anything resembling stable flight. "Gear up," she commanded, and Johnson actuated the landing gear retraction system. The massive wheels and struts folded into their wells with a mechanical groan that sounded different than normal, more evidence of battle damage to their aircraft systems. They had cleared the immediate threat of ground fire, but ahead of them loomed an even greater challenge, flying a critically damaged C-130 Hercules through the backside of Hurricane Delta, with 8 wounded special operations personnel in the cargo bay and fuel streaming from bullet holes in their wing tanks. "Santos, give me a damage assessment," Martinez called out as they climbed through 500 feet altitude. "I need to know what we're working with." The flight engineer's response was sobering. "Captain, we've got hydraulic failure, fuel leaks, electrical system damage, and what feels like structural damage to the airframe. We're flying on backup systems and prayers." Below them, the flooded airport fell away into darkness, but the hurricane's fury was just beginning to test their survival. 35 minutes into their escape from the flooded airport, Hurricane Delta decided to show Captain Martinez and her crew what real fury looked like. The backside of the hurricane, the trailing edge that meteorologists called the dirty side, hit their damaged C-130 Hercules like a freight train made of wind and lightning. The aircraft dropped 800 feet in less than 5 seconds, a violent downdraft that slammed everyone aboard against the restraint harnesses with G-forces that temporarily grayed out Martinez's vision. In the cargo bay, several of the wounded Navy SEALs groaned in pain as their injuries were aggravated by the sudden acceleration, while their team medic, Hospital Corpsman First Class Marcus Doc Williams, fought to maintain his footing while treating Petty Officer Rodriguez's deteriorating condition. Sweet mother of Major Johnson's curse was cut off as another massive updraft grabbed the C-130 and flung it skyward like a toy, the aircraft climbing 1,200 feet in a matter of seconds before another downdraft tried to slam them into the Gulf of Mexico. The altimeter spun wildly, unable to keep pace with their violent altitude changes. Staff Sergeant Santos was fighting a losing battle with the aircraft's failing systems from her flight engineer station. Warning lights flashed across her panel like a Christmas tree designed by Satan himself. Hydraulic pressure at 0, fuel quantity decreasing rapidly from bullet holes in the wing tanks, and electrical systems fluctuating wildly as lightning continued to strike the aircraft with supernatural frequency. "Captain, we've got critical systems failures across the board," Santos reported, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind and the groaning of overstressed metal. "Primary and backup hydraulic systems are gone. I'm reading fuel leaks from at least 6 different locations. And the electrical system is so scrambled, I can't trust half these readings." Martinez felt every one of those failures through the flight controls. What had once been a responsive, powerful aircraft now felt like trying to fly a school bus with the steering wheel disconnected. Every control input required enormous physical effort, and the C-130 wanted to do anything except maintain straight and level flight. The hurricane's embedded thunderstorms turned the night sky into a strobing nightmare of lightning that hit their aircraft every few minutes. Each strike temporarily blinded the crew and sent power surges through damaged electrical systems that were already hanging by threads. The smell of burning insulation filled the cockpit, mixed with the metallic taste of ozone that made everyone's hair stand on end. "Jesus, we just took another lightning hit," Johnson shouted as a massive bolt turned the cockpit pure white for several seconds. When their vision cleared, half the instruments on the co-pilot side were dark, their screens either burned out or flickering with electronic snow. In the cargo bay, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Doc Williams had established a makeshift medical station using cargo straps and equipment boxes, but treating seriously wounded patients. And the violent turbulence was like performing surgery during an earthquake. Petty Officer Rodriguez had lost consciousness twice in the past 10 minutes, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low from internal bleeding that the medic couldn't properly address without a real medical facility. "We need to get Rodriguez to a hospital immediately," Williams called forward through the intercom, his voice tight with professional concern. "He's going into shock, and I can't stabilize him under these conditions." Technical Sergeant Williams, the loadmaster, was fighting his own battle in the cargo bay as equipment that had been secured for normal flight broke loose in the extreme turbulence. A cargo pallet Weighing nearly 500 pounds, it torn free from its tie-down points and was sliding around the bay like a wrecking ball, threatening to crush anyone who got in its way. "I've got cargo breaking loose back here," the loadmaster reported, throwing himself out of the way as the massive pallet slammed into the aircraft's side wall with enough force to buckle the aluminum structure. "This turbulence is tearing the airplane apart from the inside." Martinez was discovering that flying a C-130 without hydraulic assistance was like arm wrestling a gorilla while riding a mechanical bull. The massive control surfaces required enormous physical strength to move, and her arms were already burning with fatigue from 35 minutes of constant wrestling with the flight controls. "Ghost, I need you on the controls with me," she called to her co-pilot. "This bird is too heavy for one person to control manually." Johnson immediately grabbed his side of the yoke, and together they fought to maintain some semblance of controlled flight as the hurricane continued its assault. Sweat poured down both pilots' faces despite the cabin air conditioning. Their flight suits soaked through from the physical exertion of manually controlling an aircraft that was never designed to be flown without power assistance. The fuel situation was becoming critical. Santos's calculations showed they were losing aviation fuel at a rate that would leave them empty 20 minutes before reaching Barksdale Air Force Base. Bullet holes in the wing tanks were allowing JP-8 jet fuel to stream out into the hurricane winds, creating vapor trails that could be seen through the lightning flashes. "Captain, at our current fuel consumption rate, we'll flame out approximately 15 minutes before reaching base," Santos reported, her voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. "We need to find somewhere closer to land, or we need to reduce our fuel consumption somehow." But reducing fuel consumption meant reducing power to the engines, which meant flying slower, which meant spending more time in the hurricane, a deadly catch-22 that offered no good solutions. The radio crackled with static-filled transmissions as various air traffic control facilities tried to track their damaged aircraft through the storm. But atmospheric interference made communication nearly impossible, and the crew found themselves essentially flying blind through one of the most dangerous weather systems on Earth. Any station, this is Angel 77 declaring a flight emergency," Martinez transmitted during a brief break in the static. "We are damaged. 100 to 130, with 8 souls on board, multiple critical systems failures, and low fuel. Request priority handling to nearest suitable airfield." The response, when it came, was broken and barely intelligible. Angel-7-7 ... Understand emergency ... Barksdale. Weather. Another massive lightning strike hit the aircraft, this one powerful enough to temporarily knock out their primary radio system entirely. For several terrifying minutes, they flew through the hurricane in complete electronic silence, cut off from the outside world and dependent entirely on Martinez's dead reckoning navigation to find their way home. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, despite his own wounds, had made his way forward to the cockpit area to assess their situation. The SEAL officer took one look at the instrument panel, more warning lights than green indicators, and understood immediately how desperate their circumstances had become. "Captain, what do you need from us?" Thompson asked simply, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced impossible odds before and lived to tell about it. Martinez glanced back at the wounded Special Operations leader, seeing blood still trickling from his facial wounds, but also seeing the steady gaze of a professional warrior who was ready to help however he could. "Commander, just make sure your boys are strapped in tight," she replied grimly, "because this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better." As if summoned by her words, the hurricane delivered its most violent punch, yet a wind shear so severe that it nearly tore the wings off the aircraft and left everyone aboard wondering if they would live to see another sunrise. Barksdale Air Force Base appeared through the hurricane's dissipating edge like salvation itself, its runway lights cutting through the gray dawn with the promise of safety that Captain Martinez had begun to think she'd never see again. But the sight of home brought no relief, only the realization that landing a critically damaged C-130 Hercules with no hydraulics, leaking fuel, and wounded passengers aboard would require every skill she'd accumulated in 12 years of military aviation. The base's emergency response team had been tracking their approach through radar returns that painted an increasingly grim picture. The aircraft was flying erratically, losing altitude in uncontrolled bursts, and leaving a visible fuel trail that could be seen from the ground. Every emergency vehicle on the base was already racing toward the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, crash recovery equipment, and medical teams that included trauma surgeons who'd been pulled from their beds at 0530 hours. Angel 77. "This is Barksdale Tower," came the voice of Master Sergeant Patricia Coleman, the senior air traffic controller whose steady professionalism had guided thousands of aircraft safely home over her 20-year career. "We have you on radar final approach. Emergency equipment is standing by. Say your fuel and souls on board." Martinez keyed her microphone with hands that were shaking from 47 minutes of wrestling, manually with flight controls that felt like they were connected to concrete blocks. "Barksdale Tower, Angel 77 has 12 souls on board. Fuel critical, maybe 5 minutes remaining. We have multiple wounded requiring immediate medical attention and total hydraulic failure. This will be a no-flare, straight-in approach." Major Johnson was monitoring their final approach speed with the intensity of a man calculating the difference between life and death. Without hydraulic assistance, they couldn't adjust their flaps or control their descent rate with normal precision. They were essentially flying an 80-ton glider that happened to have 4 screaming turboprop engines keeping it from falling out of the sky like a brick. "Airspeed 130 and decreasing," Johnson called out, his voice hoarse from shouting, over the wind noise that poured through cracks in the damaged windscreen. "Rate of descent 800 feet per minute. We're coming in hot and heavy, Ace." Staff Sergeant Santos had spent the final 20 minutes of their flight manually calculating fuel consumption and engine performance, working with slide rules and backup instruments while the primary systems flickered between life and death. Her final assessment was sobering. They had perhaps 3 minutes of fuel remaining at current consumption rates. "Captain, I recommend we cut engines 3 and 4 to idle and try to stretch our fuel," Santos called out from her engineer station. "If we flame out on short final, we'll never make the runway." But Martinez shook her head grimly. "Negative. We need all 4 engines for control authority. Without hydraulics, the engines are the only way I can steer this bird. We land with what we've got, or we don't land at all." In the cargo bay, Hospital Corpsman Williams was fighting to keep Petty Officer Rodriguez alive during the violent approach. The wounded SEAL's pulse was weak and thready, his blood pressure dangerously low, despite 4 fluids and emergency medications. Doc Williams had done everything possible with limited resources, but Rodriguez needed a real hospital and a surgical team, not a cargo bay medical station, held together with cargo straps and determination. "How much longer?" Williams called forward through the intercom, his voice tight with urgency. "Rodriguez is fading fast. I might lose him if this approach takes much longer." Technical Sergeant Williams, the loadmaster, had secured everything possible in the cargo bay, but the aircraft's violent movements during the approach were testing every tie-down and restraint system. The other 7 SEALs were strapped into their seats, several of them helping to steady Rodriguez's improvised stretcher as the aircraft pitched and rolled through its final descent. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, despite his own injuries, had taken position near the cockpit where he could assist with communications and crew coordination. The SEAL officer understood that they were all depending on Martinez's skill to get them home alive, and he was prepared to help however possible. 1 mile final, gear down and locked, Johnson announced as the landing gear extended with a grinding mechanical noise that sounded different than normal. More evidence of battle damage affecting even their basic systems. Martinez could see Barksdale's Runway 15 stretching ahead of them, its lights creating a blessed pathway home through the early morning gloom. But she could also see the emergency vehicles lined up along both sides of the runway fire trucks with their lights flashing, ambulances waiting with their rear doors already open, and crash recovery equipment that might be needed to extract them from wreckage. 200 feet, sink rate still high, Johnson called out, monitoring their approach with desperate intensity. Airspeed 125, slightly fast, but within limits. At 100 feet above the runway, Martinez could see individual faces in the emergency vehicle's firefighters in their silver suits, medical personnel with stretchers ready, and commanders who were already calculating rescue procedures if the landing went wrong. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. 50 feet, looking good, Johnson announced, though both pilots knew that without flaps and with limited control authority, they were coming in at nearly twice normal approach speed. Martinez felt the main landing gear touch the runway with tremendous force, the aircraft hitting the concrete hard, enough to compress the shock struts to their limits and send a shudder through the entire airframe. For a terrifying moment, she thought they might bounce back into the air, but the weight of the aircraft and the sticky rubber of the runway held them down. "We're down! We're down!" Technical Sergeant Williams shouted from the cargo bay, his voice carrying relief and triumph that echoed through the aircraft. But the landing roll was far from over. Without anti-skid brakes and with limited steering authority, the C-130 wanted to veer off the runway centerline. Martinez stood on the brake pedals, using differential braking and rudder control to keep them pointed straight down the runway as emergency vehicles raced alongside them with lights flashing. Smoke poured from the main landing gear as the brakes heated to dangerous temperatures, and Martinez could smell burning rubber and hot metal as the aircraft finally rolled to a stop 6,000 feet down the runway. The sudden silence as she shut down all 4 engines was deafening after nearly an hour of constant noise and chaos. Emergency personnel surrounded the aircraft before the propellers had stopped turning. Medical teams raced up the cargo ramp while firefighters sprayed foam on the smoking brakes and landing gear. Within minutes, Petty Officer Rodriguez was on a stretcher and racing toward the base hospital, followed by the other wounded SEALs who would all make full recoveries. 3 months later, Captain Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes as the Secretary of the Air Force pinned the Air Force, crossed the service's second highest decoration for valor on her uniform. Her entire crew received Bronze Stars with V devices for valor, while the 8 Navy SEALs they'd rescued stood in the audience, alive and healthy because one Air Force pilot had chosen to defy orders and fly into hell to bring them home. Lieutenant Commander Thompson, now fully recovered from his wounds, spoke at the ceremony. Captain Martinez and her crew didn't just save 8 lives that night. They proved that the warrior ethos that we never leave a fallen comrade isn't just words. It's a sacred trust that American service members will die to honor. In the audience, Colonel Mitchell, who had initially ordered Martinez to abort the mission, smiled with pride as he watched his subordinate receive the recognition she deserved for choosing courage over compliance, and for proving that sometimes the right decision is the one that breaks all the rules.